So slow motion footage. This is something that of course can take a powerful or impactful shot within whatever type of film you're making and make it that much more unique and add an emphasis to an already important moment. And certainly with a camera like my Sony a7S III and its ability to shoot 4K 60 and 4K 120, shooting slow motion is a great option I have when I'm delivering projects in 4K. However, for cameras like my Sony a7 III, which shoot up to 4K 30 frames per second, there are some interesting challenges that exist in terms of slow motion footage within the realm of how I would shoot for it if I intend to take something and make it slow motion later. And even with my Sony a7S III, there is still a process editing wise that exists for how I want to do slow motion footage. Now again, for a lot of people this might seem to be a simple thing of just set your camera to a 60 frame per second rate, slow it down to some degree in your editor and you're good to go, but really it isn't necessarily just that. There's a couple of general concepts and ideas that exist within the realm of doing slow motion footage that I don't think are talked about much, but are actually critically important. So I wanted to outline a couple of these concepts in terms of how to do slow motion footage, and just the general process you'll want to think through both when shooting for this footage that you intend to slow down, and then when editing it later. Of course, in order to do this, I really should go over to my computer, my desk, and kind of work through what that looks like, so let's go do that now. Alright, so we are back at my computer. My desk here now. As you can see, I have Final Cut Pro. We are going to now actually deal with the slow motion footage that we are talking about and kind of start the process of looking at that. Now I have made a new library here, which I'll use to hold the clips that I'm going to import and kind of use to demonstrate. And now we're going to make a new project for this slow motion footage and to demonstrate this. But I was waiting to do this just to highlight a couple of important points. Now you'll notice in this case, the settings that I'm going to use are already there. But we are going to make a project here that is for 4K resolution and in 24 or 2398 technically frames per second. And so how we deal with slow motion footage with respect to some of these examples is going to be centered around that. Of course, you can do similar things if you're doing this, say, in 30 frames per second or 25 frames per second if you're in, say, a PAL country. Either way, the same principles will apply. But let's make this project. So now I'm going to import the slow motion footage and make proxies for them in this case, in particular because the 4K 60 and 4K 120 examples I'm going to use would certainly need it in terms of rendering on my computer. Alright, so now the proxy files have been generated here in Final Cut Pro, and I just want to take a moment to actually talk through the different footage and sort of describe what we have here. I have 4 different clips from 2 different cameras, shot in a mix of resolutions and frame rates, and we're going to kind of use that to demonstrate the slow motion bits I'm talking about. Now again, bear in mind that each of these clips have been brought in to Final Cut Pro into a timeline that is 4K and 24 frames per second, so they're all going to look and kind of render right now at the moment in 24 frames a second. So this first clip is just a random shot here that I took in my kitchen. This is basically me spinning a Keurig K-Cup little display, and this was actually shot on my a7 III in 1080p, 60 frames per second. Now, the second clip here is from a wedding that I shot last year sometime, actually also on my a7 III, just kind of a leading shot of the couple walking down the aisle. This was shot in 4K 24 frames per second, and so we have those first 2 clips which are from a camera that does not shoot say 4K 60 or 4K 120. Does not shoot slow motion in 4K, but we're going to attempt to do some slow motion with those 2 clips. Now these next 2 clips I'm going to show were shot with my a7S III, and they were shot in 4K and at slow motion frames per second and just general frame rates. So this first one was from a modeling shoot that I did in New York City recently with another company. And this was shot in 4K 60 frames per second on my a7S III. And then the second clip is from the filter and step-up rings video. This was shot at 4K 120 frames per second, and that's just a shot of some Peter McKinnon variable NDs spinning precariously on a table. So again, we have essentially 2 clips. This first one of the K-Cups shot in 1080p 60. We have this shot in 4K 24 frames a second. We're going to attempt to get that in slow motion in 4K, in a 4K timeline. And then we have 2 clips that were shot in slow motion in camera, and we are going to essentially get them into slow motion as well. And believe it or not, there is actually a given formula that you will often want to adhere to when you're trying to slow down footage. So just to talk through this really quickly, it's actually fairly simple. You have basically your intended
project or timeline frame rate of what you're trying to render this in. So in this case, that is 24 frames per second. And then you have either the slow motion frame rate that you shot this in, which in this case was 60 frames per second, or at least the look you're trying to go for. And we'll get back to that in a bit. And really, you can ignore actually the arbitrary 50% amount you see on the one clip there that I was messing around with. This is ultimately intended so that we preserve motion blur in a sense to where even once we're slowing this down and rendering it as slow motion footage, we're going to still adhere to essentially the 180-degree rule and have a kind of smooth, consistent motion blur that we would want and expect. It is worth noting that when I shot this footage in camera, this was all shot with that 180-degree rule in mind. So anything recorded in 24 frames per second in camera was shot with a 1/50 shutter speed. Anything in 60 frames per second was shot with a 1/125, I believe, technically, shutter speed, and the 4K 120 footage was shot at a 1/250 shutter speed. So our goal here in slowing this down is to maintain consistent, smooth 180-degree motion blur when we're slowing this down, and again, we're going to be able to do this by adhering to this method described. So in this case, we will take 24 and divide that by the number 60. That gives us a result of 0.4. Now, if you multiply that by 100, you're going to get the number 40. And in this case, what this ultimately means is, as I undo this previous result, we're going to want to actually slow down our footage by 40%, or to an amount of 40%, I should say, to get sort of the intended 60 frames per second look in slow motion of how this should look in a 24-frame timeline. So again, we will go to do the number 40 here. And now we're going to play this back. And we're going to see this looks pretty nice, really smooth, kind of gives a really nice look. This sort of shows the example of why you'll want to stick to this formula oftentimes in terms of doing slow motion footage. Now let's go back to our clip of the filters that we're spinning. Now this was actually shot in 120 frames per second in 4K. Essentially what we're going to want to do is now take the same formula and just figure out how we'll want to slow this down so it looks its best. We'll take, in this case, the number 24, and we will divide that by the actual frames per second that the clip was shot in, which was 120. That will give us 0.2, which times 100 gives us the number 20. So we're going to want to use the 20% value to slow this footage down to. Now, once we do that, we have, believe it or not, here the intended look that we were going for with the slow motion footage, right? So we have what proper 120 frames a second slow motion footage in 4K looks like once it's rendered out. Just as here, we have what proper 4K 60 frames a second footage looks like once that too is slowed down properly and rendered out. Now, this formula is going to be important to keep in mind in a couple of different ways, but once we move to the A7 III footage, which does not have any of these native 4K options, this is where things get a little bit different. So let's take our first clip. Now, the interesting thing I didn't mention here is when you do import, say, 1080p footage into a 4K timeline under a project, what Final Cut Pro is going to do is automatically upscale that 1080p footage to 4K. So what you have Final Cut Pro doing is, in essence, doing the work for you that you would need to do anyway, right? If you shot something in 1080p, but you're intending to render this out in 4K, you would need to upscale this to have it work. So in this case, really, Final Cut Pro is doing that work for you. Now, other nonlinear editors like, say, Premiere and or DaVinci might have a different process for this. I believe I know in Premiere, you would have to do this manually in terms of the upscaling. But the point remains in that you will want to take any footage, say, if you shot in a lower resolution and want to upscale that. Now, again, because this was shot in 1080p in 60 frames per second, this is basically going to be the same thing that we did for the footage of our model Diana here. We're just going to basically take it, again, 24 divided by 60 is 0.4, times 100 is 40, and so I can do the same process there. Just choose 40%. And so here what we're going to see is the properly rendered 1080p upscaled to 4K, 60 frames per second, slow motion footage. Now, what you'll have to bear in mind, given the camera you shot this on, in this case, this was my A7 III, is that, you know, how would this camera and its image, say the megapixels and the sensor it uses, look once upscaled. Now, I have found that with the A7 III, which has a 24 megapixel sensor, and even with the A7S III, which has a 12 megapixel sensor, that say upscaling from 1080p to 4K does not produce any nearly noticeable difference in terms of image quality or any loss there. So now we have our final clip here that we need to address in terms of making slow motion. And this one's going to entail a slightly different, or at least one additional step in the process of getting it there into smooth slow motion footage. Mainly, as you can see up here, this was shot in 4K and 24 frames per second. And so on the resolution front, we are fine, right? Final Cut Pro didn't upscale this in any way, nor would it need to once it renders it out and exports the project. But what it will need to do at some point is sort of make up for this difference in frames, right? Because we're trying to slow this down to a given look, and it's not going to have the frames it needs to have a good, smooth, consistent slow motion look. So now let's take some of the logic we've used in the past and essentially use it again, but in a slightly different way. We have our timeline, which is 24 frames a second, and then we have, rather than the frame rate it was shot in, say with the other clips of either 60 or 120. In this case, we have the given sort of slow motion look we want it to achieve, right? So let's say we want it to be, again, 60 frames per second. We're going to, again, do 24 divided by 60. We'll get 0.4 times 100, and so we will do just that. Now, however, the problem with this is, and you're going to see this pretty quickly, is the fact that once we play this out, this just looks incredibly choppy and bad. I can't tell you how often I see slow motion quote-unquote footage that gets posted online or to different projects and things that looks like this. This is not good, I would say. So the main thing we're going to want to do is really one additional step, and this is something people often miss, which is essentially to do the following. And again, this might vary depending on the NLE you're using, but the main point here is to go to video quality, and rather than normal or any of these other options, we're going to choose optical flow, and we're going to let that render on the clip. And of course, as you can see here, Final Cut Pro will start to render this and process that. What this is going to do ultimately is have Final Cut Pro essentially analyze the image and make up the difference in the frames and sort of fill in the gaps, so to speak, of the missing frames since we've tried to slow this footage down and give it a different look. And this is going to actually make a significant difference in terms of the way this slow motion footage renders out. So now that that's complete, let's just take one more pass through it. And as we now see, this really looks like 4K 60 frame a second slow motion footage, right? This looks pretty much like most of the other clips do, right? In fact, I'll let it sort of just run into one of the other ones. Now, of course, pure 4K 60 frames per second footage will have a bit of an edge, but the point remains, having optical flow analysis is a really useful tool to be able to use. And it's worth noting that I picked this clip from this specific wedding, mainly for the fact that I actually used this very same sequence in the wedding video I published for this. I did the same exact technique that I did here. Again, shot in 4K 24p, but I wanted the slowed down look for this given leading shot moment. And so I slowed it down by 40%, performed an optical flow analysis. This was good enough to make the film. Couple was happy with it. I think this will certainly get you far, and this can certainly get you a good passable slow motion footage type of look, even if you didn't shoot that in a proper, slower frame rate that you would want to utilize for that. And so just to skim through some of these sequences before, that is essentially how you tackle slow motion footage from a couple of different perspectives. Whether your camera, say the A7 III, doesn't have the ability to shoot in 4K slow motion rates, and so you have to find other ways to accommodate that, either through upscaling and or through optical flow analysis, or if your camera does accommodate it here, like the A7S III and the clips we're seeing now, just knowing how to actually, in general, and this is true of the A7 III footage as well, slow it down to a proper percentage to get the desired look of what that slow motion footage should look like within your project. And maybe just one final point to consider here in terms of shooting slow motion footage. I can say, at least in the case of the Sony mirrorless cameras I use, if you were to utilize the slow and quick or S&Q mode in camera to shoot slow motion and to do it that way, you would not have to necessarily do any of this sort of slowing down and percentage to slow down by considerations that we just talked through here. One thing I will note though is, of course, there are caveats to shooting in these modes, whether if it's on the Sony side or whatever make and model of cameras you utilize. I know in the case of S&Q mode with Sony, you do not have the ability to capture audio with this, and so if you did, say, not want to slow down footage and still use it at normal speed, rendered in, say, 24 frames a second in the timeline, and wanted audio with that, that would not be an option. I believe there also might be an ever so slightly perceivable difference in quality or loss there compared to, say, shooting just normally in the given frame rate you wanted in one of the standard Sony codecs, but I can't speak too much in terms of pixel peeping that, but something you'll want to keep in mind as well as you're trying to tackle how you want to approach doing slow motion footage.
And so that's how to shoot and edit slow motion footage given the cameras that I own and given some of the workflows and scenarios that I presented. Now hopefully this video was of some help to you. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe if it was. I'm definitely planning on doing more tips and tricks types of tutorial videos like this one here. That is all I have to say, so thanks for watching.